All right, so this is part 2 of the evolution lecture. We left off with talking about how Darwin and Wallace came up with the theory of evolution by natural selection and how traits are inherited throughout genetic lineages and how it actually happens down at the DNA level. Today we're going to pick back up with understanding the broad picture of evolution, macroevolution, if you will. All right, so how life changes through time and what we see in the fossil record. So we're going to start with this guy here, Carolus Linnaeus. So he was a Swedish botanist, zoologist, physician, kind of a jack of all trades, if you will. He's considered the father of modern taxonomy, just meaning that he was one of the first people to do something with it. And he wrote a book, and that book divided life into 7 different categories. Something that you may have heard in your high school biology class. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. For example, kingdom, Animalia, phylum, Chordata, class, Vertebrata, order, Mammalia, things like that, all the way down to species. For example, Homo sapiens, that's genus Homo, sapiens, species. So even though we've all learned this, we actually aren't using it so much anymore, even though we've all been taught it, right? And even though it's permeated itself into a lot of parts of our life, we don't use it. And we'll talk about why that is. But first, I'm going to give you some vocabulary. Taxon, or taxa, which is plural, just means a unit of biological diversity. So it could be talking about a taxon such as Homo sapiens. A taxon could be mammals. It could be a big group. It could be a small group. It just means a unit of diversity. Okay? Phylogeny is the evolutionary tree of life. So if I say I'm studying phylogenetics, I'm saying I'm studying evolutionary relationships. That's all it means. So why don't we use ranks? So like kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. The first is that they have no real meaning. All right? And what that means is if you were to close your eyes with me and give me the definition of an order, what is it? Well, the official definition is that it's larger than a family, but smaller than a class. Well, what does that actually mean? Does it have any real meaning? Honestly, it doesn't. It really doesn't have a significant meaning. So scientists don't really like these types of things, these words that don't have any actual meaning. All right? So we don't use ranks because they also don't have any equivalency across taxa. And what that means is we can use this to compare a couple different groups. It's easier to do that than just look at this slide right here. So order Coleoptera, those are beetles. There are millions of species of beetles in the world, literally. All right? So that is an order. Another order is right here, order Tracheocrinidae. Order Tracheocrinidae is made up of one species that was based off 1/3 of a complete fossil. And the only reason either of these are named orders is because someone said so. Now in science, generally we like to do some hypothesis testing. But here, there isn't really a hypothesis. Someone just says, okay, well, I think it should be in order. That's not really good science, right? And finally, our last point here is that they're meant to reflect phylogeny, meaning evolution, but instead they reflect morphology. And morphology means shape. So morphology, for example, here, we have cats on one side, dogs on the other. You feel pretty confident that you can look at each one of these and say, yes, that's a cat, yes, that's a dog, based on the morphology that they have. Now, what actually makes a cat and what actually makes a dog? These are good questions, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But let's say we want to divide organisms up by their morphology. We can divide them up by having wings. So on the left here we have pterosaurs, we have bugs, and we have birds. They have wings. On the other side, we have a crocodilian called a ghorial. We have ants, and we have an ugly-looking T-Rex. All right? No wings, can't fly, wings, fly. Makes sense, right? Okay. Except it doesn't really. Now, we've already talked about the fact that birds here are closely related to dinosaurs. And we also know that ants are closely related to these guys here. They're both part of the insect realm. So wings may not be the most important part of this equation. So let's divide it up by limbs. Now we've got ants on one side and bugs here with 6 limbs, and then we've got all of our 4-limbed creatures here. Is this more correct? Well, maybe. But what makes one of those statements more correct than the other? Neither. Have we tested any hypotheses? No. We've just assigned what we think is the more important one and gone with it. So we haven't tested any hypotheses. So what we're going to be doing here is actually taking into account all of the different morphologies, all of the different features that these organisms have, and then test some hypotheses about who is most closely related to whom. So first, homology. Morphology that is shared between groups because it was inherited from a common ancestor. Not all similar morphologies are homologous. For example, kangaroos are bipedal, meaning they walk on 2 feet. Humans are bipedal. We didn't get that from a closely related common ancestor. Kangaroos are not closely related to humans. We got those independently from one another. Those are not homologous. Let's look at an example of this. Here are a bunch of different arms here. Okay, we have a bird, we have a cow, we have a whale right in the center, and a mole there on the end, right? And you see that these arm bones look pretty similar. If you take a look at your own arm bone, point to your humerus. It's colored red on this slide. You have a humerus. Now look at these yellow and green bones here. These are your radius and your ulna. You have those too. Find them. There's your elbow for reference. Okay? Then we have a number of wrist bones here colored in blue. We have a number of hand bones colored in tan. And then finally, we've got our finger bones colored in purple. These are homologous. All of these vertebrates here, these land animals, specifically tetrapods, got them from a common ancestor when something began crawling out of the water. So the earliest, some late fish actually had these exact arm bone structures, something we'll see in a couple billion years. And all of these come from the exact same thing. They're homologous. Sometimes we can have similar morphologies, just like the kangaroo and human example. They look similar, but they're not from the same genetic lineage, and that's called homoplasy. Homo means same, plasy means plastic. Plastic is something that we can mold. If you remember watching the movie Mean Girls, that fun hit from like the late 90s, early 2000s, I can't remember when it came out. But anyways, the plastics, that group of mean girls, the reason they were called plastics is because they could mold themselves to whoever they needed to be at the time. They could change their personality. So homoplasy is like the plastics from Mean Girls. It just looks the same, okay? So here's an example. These two critters are not closely related, but they both live in similar environments, and their environment is the desert. So they both have a very lean, narrow body that allows them to maximize water usage. Their ears are pointed back to allow sand to stay out of them, etc. They've both gotten that shape independently. That's homoplasy or convergence. They mean the same thing. Now, question here. Modern whales give birth tail first. Is that homology or homoplasy? If you'll remember, sharks give birth tail first too, and land animals give birth head first. Whales come from land animals. Whales used to give birth head first. They've recently switched to tail first. That is homoplasy. All right, so here's another great example. We have an unusually large parrot here. And what this branching diagram here is showing, these two are more closely related. This is more distantly related. That's what that is showing. So I put birds and pterosaurs here because they both have wings. They can fly. But for anybody who's ever owned a parrot, they know that parrots are pretty vicious. And that's because parrots are actually dinosaurs. So this tree is not correct. What this is showing here, this is the correct evolutionary interpretation here. T-Rex and parrots share a close common ancestor, all right, a raptor dinosaur. And that means that wings have actually evolved twice, here and over here, all right? So morphology here. What we do is we look at all of the patterns suggested by morphology. So I take into account, for example, in this particular slide right here, the shape of the beak. the shape of the neck, the number of vertebrae it has, the number of ankle bones, all of the possible patterns that we can see. And we fit it all into a giant database, and then a computer will do a very special algorithm, okay, and it will rearrange all of these different patterns to find the relationships between them. Now, there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can do that, but the way that we do it in paleontology is the one that suggests the smallest amount of convergence or homoplasy. And what that is called parsimony. And if you remember, we talked about parsimony a couple weeks ago. It can be summed up as Occam's razor, the simplest explanation, the least amount of changes. So let's figure out how to read these evolutionary trees. So here are all of our critters here. Let's make a family tree, see how these guys are related. So this is an image of the very first phylogenetic tree that was ever drawn. It was drawn by Darwin in 1837 in his notes. It later made its way into one of his books. But essentially, we call these things trees because of their branches. And you'll see a lot of tree-like terminology that comes out of it. But here we have the common ancestor and all of the descendants here. All of these are the different organisms. These two are really closely related. This is the next most closely related thing. This group here shares a common ancestor with this whole group here, things like that. All right. So here we've arranged all of our critters into one tree. So birds are here. Birds are part of the dinosaur group. There's no surprise. Dinosaurs are part of the archosaur group, which also includes crocodiles, which goes into the diapsid group, which includes snakes and lizards, all the way into the reptiles, right? Nothing I've said sounds weird so far. Reptiles are part of the amniotes, meaning they come from an amniotic egg. Amniotes also include the mammals, all right, up here synapsids. And then finally, the tetrapods. Down here is the largest group. Part of the tetrapods are the amphibians, all right? Now, all of these groups are defined by certain characteristics, and how we find these is after we run all of the morphology through a computer database. It tells us what all of the organisms within a certain group have. So all birds have a toothless beak. All dinosaurs have a hip socket with an open hole. In fancier words, it's called an acetabulum. All tetrapods have fingers and toes. All amniotes have a hard-shelled egg. These words, something we'll learn in a little bit, are called synapomorphies, traits that unite a group. So, it's right here on this slide. Synapomorphies. Syn means with or together. S-Y means with or together. Morph means shape. So it literally means shapes that unite a group together. So what is a synapomorphy of mammals? Mammals have a couple things in common. Mammals give live birth. Mammals produce milk. Mammals have fur. All right? So what about humans? So we already know humans have to have the things that mammals have, right? Live birth, milk, hair. But humans have specific traits in common. And some of those traits are large brains, right? Humans have a very large brain. Humans also walk completely upright. Those are our two synapomorphies. Now, what about tetrapods? The word literally means 4 feet. Okay, so a synapomorphy of tetrapods are fingers and toes, 4 feet. So synapomorphies are what we use to determine evolutionary relationships. To put this in context to something that might seem more familiar to you, again, let's go with Mean Girls. In Mean Girls, on Wednesdays, the people sitting at a table all had to wear pink. If you were not wearing pink, you could not join them. You couldn't sit with them, all right? If you haven't seen this movie, it really is a classic. You should, okay? So a synapomorphy of the Mean Girls is that they all wear pink. If you're not wearing pink, you're not in the group. Therefore, you don't have that synapomorphy. So if you don't walk upright, you're not a human, right? If you don't have that body structure that forces you to walk in a certain pattern, if you don't have that bone structure, okay, then you belong to another group. If you do not have fur, you are not a mammal, right? Even whales have it. So synapomorphies are only traits that only certain animals have. This is in contrast to a plesiomorphy. So these are traits that are derived from a long time ago. For example, Humans have bones. If I told everybody in the class to separate themselves out by who had bones and who didn't, everybody would have bones. That's not going to be helpful, right? So what could another plesiomorphy of humans be? What do you share with a lot of other animals? Let's say you share lungs, right? You have lungs, dogs have lungs, frogs have lungs. That's not going to help you identify anybody, right, by who they are. So we have synapomorphies. Those help us figure out what's on the tree. Plesiomorphies, plesio means ancient, morphe means shape, all right? So synapomorphy means traits that unite a group. These mean traits that are too old. All right. More vocabulary. I promise we won't give you this much vocabulary in other lectures, but this is a very important lecture for us. So a monophyletic group, mono means one, phyletic means group. So it literally means one group. That means an ancestor and all of its descendants. For example, your great-grandparents throw a reunion and your entire family shows up. That is a monophyletic group. And then we have a sister taxa. Two clades, or two groups, two taxa, that share a common ancestor. They're the most closely related things. For example, this phrase comes from your literal sister. Let's say you have a sister. Many of us do, not all of us, but that's okay. The analogy will still work, I promise. Your brother and sister are the most closely related people to you on the planet. They have 50% of each of your parents' DNA, meaning they are 100% similar with the same DNA as you. It's expressed differently. You guys don't look the same necessarily. You don't have all the same traits, but you are the most closely related to your sibling. So your sister taxon is the most closely related thing to you. This is an important part here. Only my monophyletic groups are natural taxa. And what this means is, in evolution, we only want to look for monophyletic groups. Otherwise, nothing we're looking at makes sense. And I'll show you what that means here in just a second. So first, before we get started with how this actually works, let's go through this here. Evolution acts on an A, individual, B, population, C, species, or D, community. So evolution acts on a population. And the reason for that is, think about it this way. Let's think of all the squirrels that are ever around. Squirrels live in Maine, in the tip top of the United States, all the way down to Florida, all across the United States. However, the squirrels in Maine and the squirrels in Florida aren't calling each other. Squirrels in Maine don't come down here during the winter to get away from the Maine cold. They are separated. And evolution requires that you are mating and reproducing and passing on your genes. You're not doing that with every single member of your species. You're doing that with a population, a small subset of that species. There is about a 200% chance you'll see this question again. I hope you will take that hint. So, important question. What is a species now? And how do they form? All right, so what is a species? So this isn't a simple answer. There are many ways to define a species. There's about 20 definitions now of a species. I don't hate you, so I'm not going to make you learn them. But we are going to go with the most commonly used one. And that is, a species can be defined when a male and a female can mate and they can have fertile offspring. What that means is, a male and a female can mate, they make a baby. That baby can then grow up to also mate with members within a species. So that is a species. Donkeys and horses can mate and they can reproduce and make a mule. But a mule generally cannot reproduce on its own. That means that a mule is not actually a separate species, or is not a species, and horses and donkeys are two separate species. All right? So, how organisms speciate? There's two words here, and we're going to talk about these throughout the rest of the semester, so please learn it now. Organisms can speciate through two ways. The first is allopatric. Allo means separate, patric means place. So it literally means separate place. Sympatric means SY, again, just like synapomorphy, means together, place. So it literally means separate place, together place. So in allopatric speciation, we have a population. There is a barrier that splits the two. Over time, they become completely new species. So even if they are reunited, they can no longer mate with each other. In sympatric, we actually have the secondary species forming even in contact with that first one. So sympatric speciation isn't something we see very commonly in the fossil record. So we'll talk about that first. It's a little weirder to understand, but it's not too terrible. So let's go through this. Organisms can speciate without barriers. How this can happen is many organisms will only mate during certain times of the year or during certain conditions like weather. If it's too warm outside, certain organisms won't mate, or if it's too cold. Or even in the methods of mating. So we'll take an example of Florida. There are a lot of different species of frogs in Florida. And as many of us know, frogs make a lot of noise. They ribbit. Many species of frog are actually ribbiting to call to the members of the opposite sex. So many frogs, mostly males in the frog examples here, sing very intricate songs to find female mates to reproduce. Some frogs will sing a slightly different song than the rest of the members of their species. That song may not get any responses from females. That frog may not be able to get a mate. Or that frog may get a mate, and then that mate only prefers frogs that sing that very special type of song. And over time, they'll actually start to form their own species. That's an example of sympatric speciation. Cichlids, which are a type of fish, will do the same thing. Not with songs, but with mating. They actually only mate during certain months of the year. So some fish will actually mate during September, whereas others will mate during August. So, corresponding with temperature and things like that. Now, allopatric speciation. This is what we see in the fossil record. Not because it happens more often necessarily, but because it's really hard to see sympatric speciation when organisms are in the fossil record. You can imagine fossilized frogs no longer sing. All right. So here is allopatric. Let's paint a story here. We have a lovely population of green beetles. Each of these green beetles falls in love. Okay, that's what the little R's are for. These green beetles make the next generation of green beetles. They fall in love. But alas, on one terrible day, a river floods and cuts this population right in two. Okay? On this side, let's say there's a predator who really likes eating green bugs. So maybe a blue bug is more able to pass on its genes. So this genetic mutation here that led to the blue bug is actually being passed on because the blue bug isn't in danger of being eaten. On the other side, we have a mutation that gives rise to a black and green spotted beetle. And the predators of beetles think, ew, this one looks gross, I'm not going to eat it. So then that one starts to be passed on more. Over time, they're two different species. Okay, that's allopatric speciation. So I'm going to take a quick break here for a sip of water. All right, so this is what it looks like on a phylogenetic tree. We've drawn this entire thing again. We have our ancestral population here in yellow, our two sister taxa here in green and white. Sorry for that noise, my bunny sneezed. Okay, then here again. Here we have our sister taxa. Let's name them A and X. All right, so now let's make this more complicated. We have our original scenario here. We have another split up here. Now this one, we have longer legs in this species. Doesn't really matter what it is. So here we have it. All right, we have our yellow, splits into two populations, the red and the blue, and then it splits up again here. This is just another representation. It says the exact same thing as that last one. So B and C are sister taxon. Their most closely related common ancestor is X. X and A are sister taxa. Okay? You don't need to worry about branch and node. I'm never going to ask you those questions again. That's just what those terms are called. So X is a monophyletic group. Here is our ancestor, and here are all of the descendants. We could start the ancestor here. We could start it here. It doesn't matter, okay? So we could also have this monophyletic group. All right. So here's our sister taxa. Just to give you some examples, X is sister taxon to A. You could also say B and C are sister taxa to A, but in general, it's easier to just say X and A. All right. So now that we've identified a monophyletic group, sometimes in paleontology we get it wrong. We don't know what a monophyletic group is. So that means we could sometimes accidentally make a paraphyletic group. an ancestor, but not all of its descendants. Okay? That doesn't make sense in science, so we try to avoid it, but sometimes it happens. So here's an example. Fish give rise to tetrapods. Okay? We know this through the fossil record, and you'll know this soon, coming to when you do your next homework assignment. But technically, fish should include humans. All right? So next time you walk up to your group of friends, you don't have to change what you say. And instead of saying, hey guys, what's up? You could say, hey fish, what's up? Technically, you'd be being very monophyletic, but you know what I mean. Okay. So sometimes you can also have polyphyletic. And just like monophyletic meant one, and para meant some, poly means many, meaning a group that's based not on common ancestry, but it's actually taking ancestor or descendants from a couple different parts of the tree. So here's an example. Elephants and hippos used to be thought to be closely related. They used to be called pachyderms, all right, meaning, rough skin, I believe. All right, so pachyderms. They've got a lot in common, hippos and elephants. They're both big, they're gray, they're weird looking, they're kind of mean if you provoke them. So we thought that they were closely related. But that's actually due to homoplasy that they look so similar, meaning they evolved those traits independently. So they're not closely related. Now, if you imagine, if we were doing a study on why animals got big and weird and gray, well, you shouldn't compare those two because they both did it in different situations. All right? So it's totally reasonable to refer to things like all creatures that live in the Arctic. Would that be paraphyletic or polyphyletic? Well, plants can live in the Arctic, bacteria lives in the Arctic, animals live in the Arctic. That would be polyphyletic. Or dinosaurs without birds. All right, so here's dinosaurs. Let's say here are dinosaurs. Birds would be right here. If we've cut them off, that would be paraphyletic. But if we are analyzing our evolutionary trends, we absolutely have to have monophyletic groups for this to be a good scientific study. So one of the easiest ways to think about these words is you don't need to worry about the poly or phyletic part of the word. Focus on the first four letters. Mono means one, para means some, poly means many. Okay? That helps break it down a little bit easier. So let's give this another example, because sometimes science words aren't the easiest. Okay? Let's say I'm studying this very famous family's genetics. Specifically, I want to understand the genetics of loving donuts. Okay? This is The Simpsons, right? Homer here loves donuts. It's a big part of the cartoon. So, monophyletic study. I invite the entire family so that I can test all of their genetics. Every single person here. So we start with the grandparents and we test all of the kids and then the grandkids. Okay? Paraphyletic, meaning somebody's missing. Let's say Homer was being really mean and rude again, like Homer is often doing. So Homer's uninvited. Now, that means my study is now incomplete. All right, that's paraphyletic. Now let's say Ned Flanders, the neighbor to the Simpsons, Homer and Marge specifically, shows up to the party. But no one tells me Ned Neighborino isn't actually part of the family. So now I test his genetics. I have a flawed study. That's not going to work too well, right? So that is why you need monophyletic groups. Okay? So apparently I gave an example instead of donuts of blue hair. Means the exact same thing, the whole study. All right, so make sure you can go through that again and understand the point of having mono, para, or polyphyletic groups. All right, so this slide isn't so important, but we only assign names to monophyletic groups. So let's look at this tree here. Kangaroo, who is it most closely related to, the donkey or the frog? Here we have the kangaroo. Here we have the donkey. They have a sister taxa relationship. They're most closely related. The frog is all the way down here. Crocodile, most closely related to the bird or the gecko. Here's the crocodile. Here is the bird. We have a sister taxon relationship. The gecko is all the way down here. Gecko, most closely related to the bird or the donkey. All right, so here we have the gecko. Here we have the bird. If we trace our ancestor down here, we see that they meet up right at reptilia. Okay? The donkey's all the way down here. Sister taxa, sister taxa, sister taxa. All right, and then these two big groups are sister taxa, right? All right, so this is where we stopped for the day. We'll just finish here. Okay, so conditions for fossilization. Not all things are equally fossilized. Most likely, we will find things that have hard parts, right? Like shells, bones, teeth, etc. Soft tissue, like skin and organs, will be worn away through time in the geologic record. So, amazing fossils. We generally want fast burial. The faster you bury something in sand or mud, the less likely it is for bones to be scattered, the less likely for predators to eat the skin, etc. We also want deoxygenated areas. If you have lots of oxygen, you have lots of other organisms living there. Organisms that will scavenge your dead animal, or bacteria that will break it down. So we generally want deoxygenated. Now this last question here, where we see fossils the most are marine, meaning in the ocean, and that's because we have the highest amounts of burial there. All right, so more than likely we're going to see the best fossils with fast burial, deoxygenated areas, and in the ocean. So this particular fossil, it was buried quickly in a deoxygenated environment. This fossil was not buried quickly. This used to be it is technically a cephalopod fossil. All right, it's been broken up into a bunch of pieces, was not buried quickly. All right, there are your review questions. Hope you understood everything.